Billionaire secretly followed his old black maid's daughter and found what he made him cry. On the quiet outskirts of Denver, nestled among snow-draped pines in the exclusive Cherry Hills enclave, stood a villa where every light responded to a silent algorithm and every door opened only to the precise match of a retinal scan. It was here that a man began to sense something was missing from the system he had once believed flawless. Nathaniel Reed, a reclusive billionaire who had built the nation's leading medical software empire with cold logic and elegant lines of code, had long ago abandoned the idea of chance. In his world, everything could be measured, predicted, programmed, and controlled. Yet within the span of 3 quiet weeks, 3 small items had vanished from the most secure vault in his estate. No alarms had sounded, no doors had been forced. The surveillance footage showed nothing unusual. It was as if the objects had been carried away by wind, as if they had slipped into silence, unseen by even the most sophisticated systems. Nathaniel was not a man rattled by coincidence. In his view, 3 occurrences formed a pattern, not an accident. He opened his personal computer, reviewed access logs, scrutinized each camera frame, and compared heat maps of movement within the house. Amid the cold logic of digital data, a name appeared. Subtle, but unmistakable. Clarisse Johnson. She was the oldest housekeeper in the estate, a quiet black woman who had served him faithfully for more than 25 years. Always punctual, never absent for more than 3 consecutive days, never complained, never arrived late or left early. She had become part of the house, like the old grandfather clock in the front hall. Worn, but dependable. And precisely because of that, the repeated appearance of her name in the system, aligning with the times of the disappearances, stirred something deeper in Nathaniel than the simple concern of lost items. But he did not grow angry. He did not confront her or demand answers. Instead, he marked the time, activated discreet monitoring, and waited. He handed the car keys to his driver but chose to drive himself, alone, in a silver-grey SUV. He brought no bodyguards, no assistants. He parked a few blocks from the villa, where no streetlights glowed, where no public cameras turned, just the still dark and the faint shimmer of snow. At exactly 8:15 in the evening, just as she did every night, Clarisse stepped out the side gate. In her hands, she carried a faded olive-green cloth bag, its straps worn and fraying, but she held it with both hands as if it contained something fragile. She did not hurry. She did not glance back. She showed no sign of fear or guilt. She walked for 2 blocks, then stopped beneath a dim street lamp to wait for bus 43, headed south toward the city of Denver. Nathaniel waited about a minute before starting the engine and following. He was not entirely sure what he was searching for. Perhaps an explanation, perhaps confirmation of suspicion, or perhaps, though he would not admit it, he was hoping to be wrong. Because if she truly had done something dishonest, it would mean that his entire life of placing trust in the system had been betrayed by the one person who had stood closest to him for nearly 3 decades. But what he was about to witness would not be the revelation of a thief. It would be a fracture in the perfect world he had so carefully built. A single moment capable of crumbling all his long-held assumptions about trust, about morality, and about the quiet souls who pass through our lives unnoticed. Because this was never about theft. This was about a truth so deeply human that no system, however advanced, could detect it. Something small, something silent, and yet powerful enough to stir a soul that had long since gone dry. If you've stayed with us this far, perhaps you too have begun to feel something deeply human pulsing beneath the surface of these seemingly cold and clinical details. This is only the beginning of an emotional journey we hope to share with you. If this story stirred something within you, we invite you to subscribe to the channel, give it a like, and share the video so Emotional Echoes can continue bringing meaningful stories like this to more people each day. Where are you listening from? Leave us a comment below and tell us the city or place you're tuning in from so we can see just how far this journey has traveled across the world. Thank you for being a part of this shared experience, this path of stories and emotion. And now, let us continue together as we begin to uncover what's truly unfolding behind those seemingly invisible traces. What had gone missing was not cash, nor jewelry, nor anything of traditional value. It was merely three humble items, the kind most people would overlook without a second thought. An open tube of vitamin C tablets, a leftover pack of medical masks from the previous winter, and a half-used bottle of hospital-grade hand sanitizer. In a household where even the napkins were folded into perfect triangles, where every object carried a catalogue number and a recorded inventory history, the quiet disappearance of these seemingly trivial things became the only anomaly in a world engineered down to the minute. Clarisse Johnson appeared in every access log on the exact 3 evenings the discrepancies were registered. She had made no attempt to conceal her actions. The door responded to her fingerprint, the infrared cameras recorded her movements, and the automatic lights blinked on gently each time she stepped into the rear storage room. There was no hurried motion, no furtive glance. Only an older woman, moving with habitual rhythm, opening a cabinet, checking a few items, then leaving as if tending to a household chore. And yet it was precisely that calmness, that sense of unbroken routine, that made Nathaniel feel something was being hidden in plain sight. He could not confront her. He could not accuse, because every action had followed procedure, and because deep down, he understood. Some truths do not show up on a screen. They cannot be tallied in numbers or flagged by systems. They can only be seen if one dares to step beyond the boundaries of control we have spent our lives believing to be absolute. She walked for 2 blocks, then stopped beneath a dim street lamp to wait for bus 43, headed into the busy streets of the city center, watching the polished glass towers of downtown gradually give way to aging neighborhoods where rust-speckled tin roofs leaned wearily against cracked walls. He kept just enough distance not to be noticed, yet never far enough to lose sight. Clarisse sat midway down the aisle, the faded cloth bag resting gently in her lap, her hands still clasped around its handles as if holding something fragile. Her face was unreadable, marked only by the occasional glance out the window, quiet and still. No one sat beside her, and no one seemed to notice she was there. When the bus came to a stop at a small station nestled at a lonely intersection between 2 worn-out blocks, she stepped off. Nathaniel parked half a block away, turned off the headlights, and watched from behind the wheel, holding his breath. Clarisse walked slowly, but without hesitation. She turned into a narrow alley that led to a 2-story building with a weathered sign that read Willow Haven Community Room. A soft amber glow spilled from the fogged windows, casting the blurred silhouettes of people moving inside. He wasn't sure what this place was. A community center, perhaps, an old church, a shelter. But what stopped Nathaniel cold was not the sight of Clarisse entering that building. It was the woman who emerged from behind a hanging vinyl curtain to meet her and take the bag gently from her hands. She looked to be in her early 40s, slender, with warm brown skin and sharp, bright eyes. In that moment, he recognized her. Leona, Clarisse's daughter. He had only seen her a few times before, on holidays or during one of her mother's brief illnesses. Leona moved quickly, taking the bag into a small kitchen at the back of the building, where fluorescent light bounced off shelves stacked with food containers. On the table, a neat row of plastic boxes sat, each hand-labeled in black ink: chicken soup, white rice, black beans, steamed vegetables. Simple meals, but prepared with care, arranged with the kind of thoughtfulness reserved for something ceremonial. Soon, a group of children entered through a side door. The oldest, maybe 12, the youngest, no more than 5 or 6. They walked in quiet lines, no pushing, their eyes fixed on the table with the solemn discipline of children who had long since learned to wait through want. Leona knelt to speak to each child, handing them their meal one by one, offering spoons with the gentle efficiency of someone who does this often. There was no speech, no appeal for help, no moment of self-congratulation, only the steady rhythm of kindness, repeated like a prayer. Nathaniel did not take his eyes off the fogged pane of glass. He saw Clarisse take a small cloth and wipe down the spots on the table, not taking a seat, not giving instructions, simply standing back and watching her daughter with a gaze filled with quiet pride. When one small girl looked up and asked where the food came from, Leona smiled gently and said it came from kind people who no longer needed it, but whose warmth could still fill someone's belly. There was no emphasis in her voice, no explanation offered. It was simply the truth, like the air, like the light that fell across the worn floorboards. In that moment, Nathaniel felt as though he were witnessing something entirely foreign to the world he had built. There was no blueprint for this moment. No algorithm could quantify the worth of a bowl of soup passed from a mother's hand to a daughter's, then from that daughter to a child she had never met. He had followed Clarisse seeking answers to the mystery of 3 missing items, but what he found instead was something he could not measure. He did not know how long he sat there, motionless. But when the lights inside the room began to dim and the children started to drift out in small, quiet groups, he still had not looked away from the glass. Because in that moment, what tightened in his chest was not Clarisse's action, but Leona's quiet, unwavering presence. A woman he had never paid attention to, now doing something that not even the most sophisticated charitable systems could guarantee, giving without needing to be seen. And he understood then that what he was about to uncover would no longer be about 3 forgotten items. It would be about himself. As the last children left the center, clutching their meal boxes and brief goodnight wishes, Leona remained alone in the room, now bathed only in the soft glow of yellow light, with a few plastic chairs stacked in the corner. Clarisse had already left a short while earlier, leaving behind a silence that felt intentional, as if she understood her daughter needed time alone with the things she no longer had the strength to carry herself. Nathaniel still sat in his car, hands clenched around the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the fogged window pane, as if he were trying to piece together a portrait he had neglected for far too long. The woman at the center of that portrait bore no resemblance to any personnel file he had ever reviewed. She was nowhere in the system, left no trace in the data, appeared on no chart or projection. Leona Johnson had always been a faint name in his life, mentioned now and then by Clarisse or seen briefly at Thanksgiving gatherings, offering a polite hello before disappearing again. He had never thought much about her, had never asked what she did or how she lived. But now, in the quiet surrounding that modest community center, he found himself unable to look away from her. There was no blazer, no business card, no title, just a worn coat, sleeves rolled up, and a quiet steadiness in every movement. There was something about her that unsettled him, not because of what she was doing, but because of how she was doing it. As though it wasn't a volunteer act, but something rooted deep in her being. She didn't choose to help, she simply couldn't not. She stood in that space like a lamp placed exactly where it was needed, offering light, not because anyone asked, and not because anyone was watching. Nathaniel had worked with hundreds of executives, thousands of senior staff, and written or reviewed millions of lines of code in the intelligent healthcare systems his company had built. He had taken pride in the belief that every decision should be driven by data, that every human contribution could be measured in productivity, in results, in quantifiable value. But in Leona's presence, he could find no figure, no metric, no model that could explain why she was there, why she did what she did, and why he, a man trained to measure the world, felt shaken by something so seemingly small. He remembered her eyes as she leaned down to speak with a boy, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder as if shielding him from the weight of the world. He remembered the smile she offered a little girl while handing over the last cookie, and the quiet understanding in her gaze when the girl whispered that her mother wouldn't be coming home that night. Leona didn't preach morality, didn't offer lessons, didn't call for action or applause. But every gesture, every look, spoke one simple truth. She was there because she could not stand still. The woman at the heart of this story resembled no one Nathaniel had ever met, and she defied every image he had ever constructed of someone with social responsibility. She didn't belong to a non-profit, didn't carry statistics, didn't seek grants or publish outcome reports. And yet, somehow, she was accomplishing more than the most elaborate systems he had ever designed. And perhaps what stunned him most wasn't that Leona was helping others. It was that she did it without seeking recognition. No one would ever know how many meals she had prepared, how many stories she had listened to, how many tears she had quietly wiped away within those walls. But Nathaniel knew, and now he could not return to the indifference that once seemed natural. The woman he had once considered a background figure in the life of his loyal housekeeper had revealed herself to be at the very center of a world he had never dared to enter. A world with no control panel, no performance dashboard, only raw compassion and genuine presence. And he understood, from this moment forward, he was no longer on the outside looking in. Nathaniel returned to the villa just as the clock struck 10. Snow had begun to fall, a light dusting of white settling over the still roads like the softest breath of winter. He turned off the engine, but remained in the car for several minutes, eyes fixed on the dashboard display, though his mind was still caught in that small room at the community center where Leona had stood like a steady pillar amidst lives as fragile as paper. He entered the house without turning on the lights. The villa responded as it always did, flawlessly. Hallway lights flickered on in measured sections with each of his steps. The motion sensors reported no signs of intrusion. The refrigerator confirmed a full stock of food, and the inventory control system showed no anomalies. Everything was perfect. Except for one thing, Clarisse. Her name echoed in his mind like a note left unresolved. He reopened the access logs to the personal medical supply vault, the private storage for household health provisions. Clarisse had appeared precisely 3 times over the past 3 weeks, and each of those times matched the disappearance of one of the missing items. But after what he had just witnessed, Nathaniel no longer felt like a man seeking evidence to assign blame. He was following the faint trail of something deeper, something he needed to understand. He reviewed the supply list again, this time sorted by expiration date. And then he saw what he had missed. All 3 missing items were marked as nearing expiration. The system had been programmed to alert staff to dispose of such items within a window of 24 to 48 hours after the warning. In other words, they were no longer deemed necessary. They had become waste, waiting for disposal. Clarisse had not taken anything of value. She had not hoarded for herself. She had simply, quietly, redirected what this house no longer needed to a place that did. Nathaniel closed his eyes and leaned back in the chair, releasing a long, quiet breath. A slow, simmering shame settled in his chest. Not loud, but persistent. He had believed she was hiding something dishonest. That Clarisse's silence was a veil for wrongdoing, loyalty misplaced. But she wasn't hiding a crime. She was shielding a need no one wanted to see, much less acknowledge, in a society that prided itself on abundance and advancement. A place where something as modest as a vitamin tablet, a clean mask, or a half-used bottle of sanitizer could still mean the difference between sickness and safety. He thought of her eyes as she worked in his home, always calm, always careful, never crossing boundaries. She had never asked for more, never requested anything. And perhaps because of that, he had never thought to ask her what she might need. He had never really looked at those hands, weathered and worn by time, to imagine how many fragile bodies they had cared for, how many dying people they had held. Because before she became a housekeeper, Clarisse had been a nurse, a woman who once saved lives not for salary, but for the simple weight of responsibility. And even now, though no longer in a hospital, she had not stopped. She had simply passed that duty into the hands of her daughter, through the smallest items that everyone else forgot. Nathaniel no longer felt betrayed. If anything, he saw now that he had been the one to betray the quiet trust of people he had long believed were simply fulfilling roles. He had lived in a world of sealed edges and metrics, where everything was measured in output and return, every choice filtered through efficiency and gain. But Leona and Clarisse moved in a world apart. A world where action didn't need permission, only timing. Where silence was not indifference, but a steady kind of endurance that asked for no praise. And he knew now that he could not go back to being who he was. Because if he continued to close his eyes to that need, he wouldn't just be allowing a few expired supplies to go to waste. He would be allowing the people who needed them most to remain invisible in the very society he believed he was helping to build. The next morning, Nathaniel did not leave the villa as he usually did. He cancelled his meetings, silenced his email notifications, and spent nearly the entire morning seated before his screen, pulling up detailed reports on the supply vault, access logs, and personnel files he had so often skimmed only when something went wrong. He wasn't searching as a manager now. He was searching as a man who wanted to understand someone who had quietly lived beside him for over 2 decades. But there wasn't much data. Clarisse Johnson's profile was simple. A few medical certifications dated back over 30 years. Her contact information had never changed. She had never requested a raise, had never taken more than 10 days off in any given year, no special notes, no exceptional performance reviews. A perfect employee on paper, yet almost invisible. The system did not record the nights she stayed late to clean the kitchen after a dinner party. It didn't log the moment she picked up a scarf a guest had forgotten, washed it, folded it, and returned it to the living room as if it had never been lost. And it certainly did not know that every evening, after the house had gone quiet, she still walked room to room, gently checking the thermostat settings just in case he felt cold, but wouldn't say so. There are some things no data can measure, like loyalty, patience, or the kind of care that reveals itself in gestures so small they go unnoticed unless you are paying attention. Then he opened Leona's file, but there was none. Not in his system. She wasn't an employee, a vendor, or someone with any form of access credentials. And yet now, her name sat at the center of a string of questions he hadn't yet learned how to answer. He turned to public records. Leona Johnson, 42 years old. A middle school art teacher at a public school in Denver. No outstanding debts. No legal disputes. 2 community service awards from local organizations. A life so ordinary that most would scroll past without noticing. But this woman was the quiet link, the steady hand that had created a bridge between resources presumed useless and people whose needs remained unseen. In small photos from local news clippings, she stood beside her students, holding a paintbrush, always looking toward the children, never toward the camera. She didn't build a brand. She didn't fundraise. She didn't seek recognition. And maybe that was why she was able to do what those chasing applause so often forgot how to do. Be truly present, day after day, hour by hour. Nathaniel found himself recalling the look in her eyes the night before. Not startled when she noticed him watching, not flustered, just present, calm, as if she knew that what she was doing was right, even if no one else would validate it. In the world he had spent his life building, every decision needed approval from a system. But in Leona's world, some actions didn't need permission. They just needed to be done. Because someone was hungry. Because someone needed a hand held out. She didn't ask if she could take the 3 items. She knew they were about to be discarded. She didn't explain why she brought them to a place nearly an hour away. She didn't need to, because not everything good requires a justification. Nathaniel sat in silence for a long time. What lay before him was no longer just a screen. It was the image of 2 women. A mother who had spent a lifetime working in quiet shadows, keeping everything running smoothly without ever asking to be seen. And a daughter who had inherited that quietness, but chose to carry it beyond the villa's walls, to touch lives that might otherwise have been forgotten. And then he understood. What had changed him wasn't something the data could show. It wasn't the missing items. It wasn't a flaw in the system. It was a small act by a daughter, shaped by a mother, carried out in silence, in patience, and in the unwavering belief that giving does not need to be witnessed to matter. That morning, when Clarisse entered the kitchen to begin her usual routine, she had no idea that Nathaniel was already there, seated quietly at the table. He wasn't wearing his usual tailored suit. There was no laptop open, no phone at his side. Just an aging man, silent, holding a cup of tea that had long since gone cold, his eyes following her every movement as if he were watching a film he had ignored for years. Clarisse didn't startle. She didn't falter. She paused for only a moment, gave a gentle nod, and continued, taking bowls from the cupboard, reheating food, wiping down the counter. Her motions were slow, deliberate, familiar, so precise they bordered on meditative. Nathaniel wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but every word he thought of felt too small. How does one begin, after all these years, without ever having asked her how she was, if she was tired, or how her daughter was doing lately? It wasn't until she placed a fresh cup of tea before him, just as she did every morning, that he finally found his voice. It wasn't a question, just a whisper, barely audible. "I followed you." Clarisse's hands paused, but she didn't look at him. Her expression didn't shift. A quiet moment passed, then she lowered herself into the chair across from him. Her back was slightly hunched, hands folded calmly in her lap, eyes gazing out the window where early sunlight filtered gently through the trees. She didn't say she was angry. She didn't ask what he had seen, because she knew he had seen enough. Enough to understand that some truths do not need to be spoken to be real. Then she smiled. A quiet smile, not weary, not defensive. And she said that some things don't belong in job descriptions or task lists. They are simply what one ought to do, when they can. "I never meant to take anything from you. Those things, if no one was going to use them, might help someone live one more day. That's all." She said it the way one might talk about running errands or preparing breakfast. No emphasis. No justification. No plea. Nathaniel could only sit and listen, and what rose in him wasn't guilt, not exactly, and not shame either. It was a kind of smallness, a deep, quiet humility before a kind of character he had never truly seen. Clarisse never taught with speeches. She didn't stand before crowds, didn't make grand declarations. But every day, through the way she lived, she left behind lessons both subtle and lasting. Leona had grown up in a home with little money, but filled with discipline, empathy, and dignity. She wasn't allowed to waste, wasn't allowed to overlook the pain of others. And she learned these things not from books, but from watching her mother break her last piece of bread to share with a stranger waiting in the rain at a bus stop. Every small act Clarisse performed in silence, from washing a worn coat and delivering it to a shelter, to leaving leftover food in a paper bag beside the garbage bin, with quiet hope, was a seed planted in her daughter's heart. No lectures, no pointing fingers, just a life lived according to what she believed was right. Nathaniel looked at her and understood that not everyone who gives needs to be known. Some give simply so the world can keep turning in a gentler way, even if they're never thanked, never named, never seen. Clarisse was one of those people. And Leona, somehow, had become the voice of everything her mother never said aloud. She had acted without being asked. She had built an invisible system not with code, but with compassion. And it was that system, not a technological failure, that had awakened something in Nathaniel. Not a glitch, but an absence, a missing presence of heart in the very systems he once believed to be flawless. Clarisse didn't need him to understand. She didn't need him to change. She simply sat, sipped her tea, eyes steady, peaceful. But for him, that moment was the first lesson, a teaching without words, a love that needed no acknowledgement, a life of service that asked for nothing in return. And he understood then that was how she had taught all her life, not through instruction, but through the quiet, unwavering truth of how she chose to live. A week after that quiet conversation in the kitchen, Nathaniel arrived at the Willow Haven Community Center on an unannounced Saturday afternoon. He came alone, no assistant, no car service. Just a simple wool coat draped over his shoulders and a large box in his arms, filled with surplus medical supplies he had personally selected from the villa's storage room. When he stepped inside, the room was already alive with children. Some were snacking, others sat clustered around tables scattered with colored paper and wax crayons. No one looked up to question who he was. No one asked. And Nathaniel felt a strange relief in that. He saw Leona in the corner, helping a young boy cut shapes from construction paper, her hands streaked with glue and flecks of color. She glanced up, offered a soft nod, no surprise, no interrogation, as if his presence was neither unexpected nor disruptive, but simply a natural part of the room's unfolding rhythm. He set the box down in one corner without a word, and quietly took a seat on a small wooden chair near the children. 2 seats away, a little brown-skinned girl, no more than 7, with twin braids and a tight grip on a purple crayon, was lost in her drawing. She was sketching a large house with a red-tiled roof, 4 arched windows, and a row of trees flanking a stone path. Nathaniel glanced over and smiled, a slow, startled recognition blooming inside him. It was his house, his villa, rendered in clumsy but surprisingly accurate lines. He leaned forward slightly and asked gently, "Whose house are you drawing?" Without lifting her eyes, still focused on shading the roof, she replied, "The big house at the end of the hill. I saw it when I walked past with my mum. It's really pretty, like a castle." He nodded, then asked, "Why didn't you draw anyone inside?" She paused, just for a moment, then answered, still coloring, "I've never seen anyone in the windows. No one ever comes outside. I think maybe nobody lives there." Nathaniel sat still. Her words struck something deep and quiet inside him. That house, the one he had lived in for more than 20 years, with all its luxury and airtight security, had appeared to this little girl not as a home, but as an empty shell. A beautiful structure with no signs of life, a perfect facade for a loneliness hidden behind layers of sleek technology. He looked again at her drawing. Every window was closed, no smoke curled from the chimney. No cars in the driveway, no voices, no laughter, no hint that anyone truly lived within its walls, just a cold, stunningly accurate representation of what he had unknowingly become. Leona approached then, placed a gentle hand on the child's shoulder, and leaned down with a quiet whisper, "You can draw someone in, if you want." The girl looked up, tilted her head in thought, then nodded. Her tiny hand reached for another crayon orange this time, and she began to sketch a small figure standing at the door. Nathaniel didn't know who the figure was meant to be. Perhaps it was someone imagined. Perhaps it was her, or her mother. But what he did know was this: a house only becomes a home when someone is willing to step outside the door, open themselves, and be present. Not through smart devices or impeccable design, but through something deeply, stubbornly human. A look, a question, a meal shared, an invitation offered. and from a child he had learned what decades of data and success had never taught him, that no matter how grand, no matter how secure, a house is nothing more than concrete and silence without the presence of the human heart. Nathaniel stayed behind at the community center for nearly an hour after the children had left. Leona was still tidying up, quietly gathering half-finished drawings, wiping down the tables, and sorting the jars of paint back into their plastic containers. Neither of them spoke much. The room was filled only with the gentle scrape of chairs and the soft clinking of lids and supplies being returned to their places. Then the little girl who had drawn the villa returned, a small backpack slung over her shoulders. She stood directly in front of him, clutching the finished drawing in her small hands. She held it out without a word, then looked up at him with eyes that seemed to be waiting for something, recognition, perhaps, or permission to let go. Nathaniel took the paper and nodded his thanks. The drawing now showed 3 people, a woman with curly hair standing in the doorway, a child holding a cookie, and a man in a long coat with glasses. They stood close to one another, not smiling exactly, but their eyes were brighter than the rest of the scene, outlined and colored as if lit from within. He didn't ask who was who. He didn't need to. The answer was already there, in the stillness of the girl's gesture, in the quiet message left on the page. As she turned to go, Leona, watching her from across the room, spoke softly, as if to herself. That little girl used to live near my old neighborhood. When her mother passed, I was the one who brought her here. A few weeks later she started to draw, but she never drew people inside the houses. Nathaniel looked again at the drawing, then at Leona. She kept cleaning, voice steady, stripped of drama or sentimentality. There was no sorrow in her tone, no appeal for sympathy. It was simply a thread in the fabric of all the moments she had chosen to be present for, not in theory, but in flesh and time. No ideology, just presence. A while later, Nathaniel left. As his car climbed the winding road back toward the villa, the slope opened into a view of the entire estate. From here, the house looked just as the girl had drawn it. He remembered her words from earlier that day about how beautiful it was, like a castle, but how she had never seen anyone inside. And then, as the car's headlights swept across the front of his home, he whispered to himself, as if finally naming something he had long known but never admitted, "That house is full of light. But no one is really there. No one really lives in it. No voices, no smell of food, no warmth passed from one hand to another." Everything functioned flawlessly, yet the most essential element that made a place a home was missing. When he stepped inside, every sensor responded as it should. Lights turned on. The heating adjusted automatically. A security status report buzzed gently on his phone. But now, all of it, the efficiency, the precision, felt like a quiet echo inside a shell. It no longer brought comfort, only made the loneliness more sharply visible. Not because he lacked anything material, but because he had no one to share anything that truly mattered. The girl's drawing was still in his hand, and in a rare moment of clarity, he felt no desire to frame it, no instinct to hang it like a decoration. He wanted to keep it exactly as it was, a reminder, a quiet witness, that a house, no matter how brightly lit, can remain entirely empty if no one belongs to it. The next day, Nathaniel returned to Willow Haven, but this time he did not stand at a distance. He stepped into the room in the late afternoon, just as golden light poured through the frosted windows, casting a soft honey glow across the floor. Leona was seated at the far end of the room, holding a pencil, helping a young boy adjust his drawing. She heard the door open, but didn't turn around. She simply said, "There's no class today." Nathaniel replied quietly, "I didn't come to learn." She turned then, her eyes not surprised, only narrowing slightly, as if to measure what it was he had come for. She didn't offer him a seat. He didn't wait to be asked. He pulled a small wooden chair closer, sat down across from her, keeping a polite distance. He didn't begin with an apology. He knew it wouldn't be enough. Not enough to erase the years of silence. Not enough to undo all the chances he'd had to see and understand, and had chosen instead to turn away. Instead, he said simply, "I saw you. I saw what you do. And I realized I've never really looked at anyone closely in my life." Leona didn't respond immediately. She looked at him for a moment, then lowered her gaze and resumed sharpening the boy's pencil. After a pause, she said, "I don't need to be seen. I just need not to be stopped." Nathaniel nodded. "I understand. And I know I've been the one standing in the way without even realizing I was blocking the path. I'm not here to justify anything. I'm here to ask if I can step aside." Leona set the pencil down, crossed her arms loosely over her chest. Her eyes weren't cold, but they weren't forgiving either. They carried the quiet fatigue of someone long accustomed to doing everything herself. She said, "You have a lot: money, influence, connections. What I have is time, trust, and a bit of patience. What you see here isn't a model. It's not something that can be replicated with formulas or rolled out in phases. These are people, and people don't need to be managed. They need to be heard." Nathaniel said nothing. There was nothing to argue. Every word she spoke landed with precision, and each one felt like a blade slicing through the complacency he had worn for too long. Finally, he asked, "What can I do to help?" It wasn't a performative question. It was a necessary, honest step back. Leona studied him for a long moment, then replied, "If you want to help, don't stand on the stage. Don't put your name on a donor wall. Just be there when needed. Listen when someone speaks. Stay quiet when others are doing good work. You don't have to do anything big. Just don't make it harder." Nathaniel nodded. He had spent his life directing, strategizing, shaping systems, but this, for the first time, required him to take a supporting role, to be a learner, not the architect, but the student. He stood, ready to leave, when Leona added, "You know, I used to hate your house, not because it was big or beautiful, but because every time I walked past it I saw my mother in there so small, like a shadow. My mother was once a great nurse, but in that house she became an invisible maid." Nathaniel turned, and for a brief moment the pain on his face was plain. But Leona continued, "I don't hate it anymore, because it seems like it's starting to change. Or at least, someone inside is starting to open the door." He didn't respond. He simply bowed his head slightly, then walked out. For the first time in many years, he felt no need to say anything more. Because silence, when born from acknowledgement, can be an answer. And their first real conversation did not begin with an apology. It began with the truth. A truth that was not easy to hear, but one that had to be accepted because only through that truth could either of them begin to move forward. The next day, Nathaniel returned to Willowhaven at lunchtime. He brought with him 2 large boxes, one filled with sandwiches and packaged fruit, the other with bottled water, wet wipes, and several kits of personal medical supplies he had gathered from the villa's storage room. No one had asked him to bring them. There was no plan, no written agreement, no memo of approval. But he understood now that some things don't need permission to matter. When he set the boxes down on a table in the corner of the room, a few children drifted over. They didn't look at him like a stranger anymore. They didn't call him the strange old man, as they had in those early days. They just accepted the food with quiet nods, thank yous spoken not with words, but with the simple, natural motion of small hands, reaching out without fear. Leona stood at the far end of the room, observing but saying nothing. She was showing 2 little ones how to fold paper animals, her fingers steady, patient. Nathaniel noticed the faintest smile at the corner of her lips when a young girl raised her first paper crane with pride. Once the children had settled, Nathaniel walked over to her. She didn't look up, only said softly, "You don't have to do this every day." He replied, "I know, but I also know that if I wait for permission, I'll never start." Leona looked up then. Her eyes were quiet, not unkind, but not easily impressed either. She said, "Some things don't wait for approval to become urgent. Hunger is one of them. So is illness, loss, loneliness. They don't take turns. They don't follow schedules." Nathaniel stood still. Her words struck something deep, something he'd buried for years beneath titles, responsibilities, performance reports, and polished rhetoric. He had once built the state's first automated medical distribution network. He'd won awards for optimizing emergency supply chains to reach remote communities in record time. But he had never stopped to think that, in the very city where he lived, there were children waiting for a meal as if waiting for a miracle. Leona went on. "My mother used to say, if you have a loaf of bread, share half. If you have nothing, share your time with someone who needs it." Nathaniel nodded, eyes lowered toward his hands. Hands that had signed hundreds of contracts, written policies, approved protocols, yet for the first time they felt quiet, unoccupied, and unsure. He exhaled slowly and asked, "Is there anything else you need?" Leona glanced toward the children. She said, "I don't need anything for myself, but the kids could use more drawing paper, new brushes, colored pencils, and sometimes just an adult willing to sit still long enough to hear their whole story." Nathaniel smiled. She didn't need a large budget, no 10-page proposal, just presence. Honest, undistracted, unperformed. He stood there for a moment longer, then walked back to the table, reached into his coat pocket, and pulled out a small notebook. He began to write a list of things to bring the following week. Not because he felt guilty, but because he knew if he didn't do it today, someone would have to wait until tomorrow. And some needs cannot wait. Leona came closer, her voice lower now, a little gentler. "You know," she said, "I've never asked anyone's permission before helping a child. I just did it, because I couldn't do otherwise. If I'd waited for permission, a lot of kids would have been left behind." She looked at him then, not to challenge, but to share something essential. Her gaze was steady, not accusing, only honest. "Some things in this world don't wait for anyone," she said. "Hunger is one of them." And Nathaniel nodded, not this time to agree, but to remember. Like an unspoken law, quiet, inarguable, and permanent. That night, when Nathaniel returned to the villa, he didn't go straight to his office as he always did. Instead, he paused before a door deep in the west hallway, a door no one in the house had touched in years. It was dusted regularly, its lock maintained by the automated system, always ready to open. But it hadn't. Not since one long-ago winter. The winter that had quietly altered the entire trajectory of his life. He placed his hand on the surface of the door, his fingers trembling slightly. Not from cold, but from the knowledge of what lay behind it. The thing he had spent years avoiding, burying, smothering beneath flawless systems, endless meetings, and a schedule so full it left no room for silence. When the door opened, the room remained exactly as he had left it. A small bed with a cream-colored blanket, stuffed animals neatly arranged in the corner. A wall sketched in pencil with butterflies and crooked kites. On the shelf sat a row of picture books, some with bent spines from too many readings. The ceiling light cast a soft glow over the thin layer of dust on the desk, where a colored marker still lay uncapped. He stepped inside slowly, as though afraid to shatter the quiet. Each footstep stirred something buried deep. This was his daughter's room, the child who had died at 9 from a rare illness he hadn't noticed in time. In the years since, he had not set foot inside. Hadn't allowed anyone to clean it, hadn't let her name be spoken aloud. He hadn't cried, hadn't screamed. He had simply locked the door. As if not seeing the room might keep the pain still, silent, contained. But today, after the conversations with Clarisse, with Leona, after meeting children whose names he didn't know but whose hunger he now understood, he realized the pain had never been sealed behind that door. It had been with him all along, woven into the silence he had imposed upon himself, in the way he had retreated into a world of data and algorithms, avoiding the raw truth of loss, of helplessness. He sat down on the edge of the bed, his hand resting on the worn corner of a small pillow, and for the first time in years he let himself remember. Her laugh, her eyes, the last question she asked before she closed them for good. "Daddy, are you here?" Back then, he hadn't answered in time. But now, in this quiet room layered with dust and memory, he whispered, softly but clearly, "I'm here. I'm really here. Not behind a closed door, not behind a fortress of productivity and control, but here, within the memory that still lived, learning not just how to survive, but how to live again. Fully, present, human." Nathaniel sat for a long time in that small room that once belonged to his only daughter. Everything inside remained untouched, as if time itself had chosen to pause at the final moment. Each toy, each watercolor painting, each faint pencil mark on the wall spoke in a language. Beyond words, quiet whispers of everything he had once overlooked. He could no longer remember the last time he had read her a bedtime story, or how long it had been since their Saturday afternoon walks came to an end. Every small detail in the room had become a question, and the only answer was absence. His absence, from the life of the child he had loved but hadn't fully shown up for. After her death, he hadn't cried in front of anyone. There had been no elaborate funeral, no framed memorial photos. He had turned the loss into a technical void, something to be managed, not mourned. He buried himself in work, extended hours, expanded the company, designed surveillance systems for the household, as if he could engineer safety into the future, as if structure could replace presence, as if precision could erase the helplessness of the past. But deep down, he had always known the truth. When the one moment that truly needed him came, he wasn't there. He had chosen silence. Not because he was strong, but because he was afraid. Afraid that if he said it aloud, everything he had built around himself would collapse. Afraid that touching the memory would pull him under. But silence never erases what has been lost. It only deepens the distance between you and what remains. In the dim quiet of that room, he thought of Leona and Clarisse, of how they faced loss not by denial, but through action, not in grand gestures, just by refusing to turn away. And he understood now that from the moment he chose not to speak, he had begun to lose something far more essential, his own humanity. He could no longer change what had happened. He couldn't rewrite the years he had spent locked away from grief. But perhaps he still had time to change how he moved forward. Not by speaking to be heard, but by listening to those he once failed to notice. This silence now was no longer a shield. It was a beginning, a space where he could learn how to feel again, not from the head but from the heart, not through calculation but through presence. And maybe, from this quiet place, he could begin not to undo but to become. The following week, Nathaniel returned to Willowhaven on a sunlit morning. A soft breeze whispered through the old oak trees outside, and the light that spilled into the classroom felt as if it had been made for life to grow there. But this time, he didn't arrive as someone once cloaked in authority. He brought no boxes of supplies, no offers of funding or plans. Just a simple backpack on his shoulder, inside it a small watercolor set and a notebook he had bought himself from a quiet corner stationery shop near his home. When he opened the door, the room was already alive. Children were gathered, busy with drawings and crafts, surrounded by a few volunteers. There was laughter, the sound of scissors cutting through paper, a gentle song playing from a small speaker in the corner. No one noticed him right away, and that, he realized, was the most comforting part of all. He was no longer the center of attention. No handshakes, no expectant stares, no air of assumption. Just an old man who sat down beside a child, struggling to hold her paintbrush. He leaned slightly toward her, smiled, and asked, "Need some help?" The girl glanced up, hesitant, then nodded and held out a damp sheet of paper. "I was painting flowers, but the colors ran everywhere." Nathaniel took the brush, gently dabbed the excess water with the edge of his handkerchief. Then he showed her how to dilute the paint, how to keep the brush light so the petals would hold their shape. No lecture, no instructions, just two people sharing a quiet moment of focus, calm, and something that looked like trust. A few minutes passed. Then other children began to draw closer. One asked if he could draw dogs. Another held up a half-folded paper airplane for him to fix. When Leona emerged from the back office, she saw Nathaniel sitting on the floor, surrounded by a small circle of children, sleeves stained with color, glasses slipping down his nose, and a smile he didn't even seem to notice he was wearing. She didn't call him aside. She didn't interrupt. She just stood there for a moment, observing, then turned to the person next to her and said softly, "He came back, but not as a boss this time. As a guest, someone who knows when to be quiet, someone who listens instead of directing, and more than that, someone who's truly present." That day, Nathaniel gave no speeches. He proposed no changes, no expansions. He stayed, finished one painting with the children, then helped clean up. Before he left, he stacked the paint jars, folded the rags, washed his hands, and turned to the little girl with the flower painting. He leaned down and whispered, "You did beautifully. Next time, you'll have to teach me how to color." The girl giggled and nodded with great certainty. The hallway he walked out into was still full of sunlight. But inside him, for the first time in many years, there was no weight, no role to uphold, no legacy to protect, no image to preserve, only a rare, unfamiliar lightness. Because when a person stops going somewhere to be acknowledged, that is often the moment they truly begin to belong. A few weeks after that morning he spent coloring with the children. Nathaniel had become a familiar face at Willow Haven. He didn't come every day, but he always showed up when it mattered. When there was a picnic that needed someone to pack lunches. When a boy came down with a sudden fever and the adults nearby hadn't yet found medicine. When a worn-out rug tore and needed replacing before a child could trip over it. He no longer carried the presence of a man once featured on magazine covers. He had shed that image. What remained was something quieter, a man of simple gestures, steady hands, and unexpected patience. Little by little, the children began to wait for him, not because they knew he had once been wealthy, but because he knew how to lean in and listen to their stories without interrupting, without ever checking his watch. One chilly afternoon in late autumn, as the wind slipped past the taped windows and warmth gathered in the corners of the room, Nathaniel was sitting with a group of kids, cutting colored paper, when a boy with bright, searching eyes walked up beside him. In his hands was a thick bundle of pencil sketches. He looked at Nathaniel seriously and asked, "Mr. Nathaniel, do you know how to draw a dream?" The question caught him mid-motion. He looked up, surprised, then smiled gently. "I don't think dreams have a fixed shape," he replied. "How do you draw yours?" The boy answered without hesitation, "I don't know, but sometimes there are things I really want, and when I close my eyes, they show up clearer than anything I see when I'm awake. I just don't know how to put them on paper so someone else can see too." Nathaniel nodded, something inside him softening. He understood that feeling more than he could say. All those years of non-stop work, of company expansions and relentless goals, he too had carried dreams without form. A whole family around one table, a dinner with laughter. A daughter who lived long enough to grow into peace. They had faded over time, like dust gathering on a mirror no one had cleaned, but he had never drawn them. Maybe because he believed dreams had to wait for the right resources, the right moment, the right version of himself. But these children didn't wait. They picked up whatever tools were in front of them, crayons, glue, imagination, and they tried, even when they had nothing but the shape of longing. He asked the boy, "Do you want to draw that dream with me?" The boy nodded. Together, on a large sheet of paper, they began to sketch. A house with chimney smoke curling upward, trees lining the yard with open hands like they were waving, a warm bed with a curled-up cat at the foot. There was no plan, no perfect perspective, just fragments of something kind and real, a world where each child had a place. When the drawing was finished, the children gathered around. One pointed at the door and asked, "Does that one lock?" Another noticed the 3 chairs and asked, "Why are there only 2 people?" A little girl whispered, "The empty seat, that's for the person who's still coming." Nathaniel looked at the uncolored space on the paper, left blank and waiting. He didn't explain it. He didn't need to, because in that moment he realized he wasn't the builder of this world. He was being invited into it, slowly, humbly, not as a leader, but as someone welcome to stay. Leona stepped beside him, looked at the drawing for a long moment, then said softly, "You know, a lot of these kids never dared to draw dreams before. They're used to living in such constant lack. Dreaming started to feel like too much to ask. But now it's different, because someone's sitting with them, not promising anything, not handing things out, just being here." Nathaniel said nothing. He felt his chest loosen, as though something long held had finally exhaled. He no longer thought about data, or efficiency models, or year-end reports. He thought about one thing: how sometimes the best way to understand someone's dream is simply to ask, "Do you want to draw it together?" No leadership course had ever taught him that, but the children had. And Leona, with her unwavering presence, quiet but unshakable, had reminded him how humans truly connect, not with declarations, but with unfinished sketches, with spaces left open, and with a question so simple, yet so moving, it could open hearts. "Do you know how to draw a dream?" That afternoon, as the sunlight shifted into a golden honey hue, and the children began to quietly pack away their brushes and papers into storage bins, Nathaniel remained seated on the floor beside the dream painting, now laid out to dry. The boy who had drawn it asked if he could take the painting home. Nathaniel nodded but said gently, "Let it dry a little more." Everything in that moment felt light, calm, one of those rare pauses in the lives of children who didn't have many places to feel safe or still. Then, in the quiet that followed, a faint sound echoed from the small kitchen in the back, a soft clang of metal, followed by an unnatural silence. Leona, who usually lingered there preparing meals for the children who stayed late, didn't appear as she always did. Nathaniel's brow furrowed. A flicker of unease moved through him, subtle but sharp enough to push him to his feet. He walked toward the back and opened the wooden door leading into the kitchen. There on the floor was Clarisse. She was on her knees, one hand gripping the edge of a low shelf, eyes tightly shut, her breath shallow and rapid. A metal tray of bowls had slipped from her grasp and shattered nearby. No cry for help, no gasp, just a quiet collapse, right in the heart of the place where kindness was served each day. Nathaniel rushed to her side, kneeling beside her, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. He called her name once, then again, and again. No response. She was conscious, but barely upright. Her thin, fragile hands trembled. The dish towel she had been holding slipped to the floor, and in her eyes, those sharp, knowing eyes he had grown to trust, there was now a fog of disorientation. A volunteer came running in, took in the scene in a glance, and pulled out their phone to call for an ambulance. Children were kept outside. Leona stood firmly in the doorway, her voice low but steady, asking everyone to remain calm. Nathaniel sat on the floor, supporting Clarisse's weight, his arm braced behind her back. She stirred then, her eyes fluttering open. Her voice, when it came, was hardly more than a breath. "It's not that I've been hiding it," she said. "I just didn't want to be a burden." He tightened his grip slightly, steady and warm. "You're not a burden," he said. "Not now. Not ever." Clarisse looked at him, the edges of her mouth trembling, though it was unclear whether from fatigue or something deeper. Then she closed her eyes again, not unconscious, just resting, as if in this moment, for the first time in years, she allowed herself to let go, to stop holding up the world alone. And in that small, still space, Nathaniel understood something more deeply than any emergency response model or relief strategy he had ever drafted. That sometimes the ones who hold others up for so long are the very ones no one thinks to catch when they start to fall. That those who carry everyone else are rarely asked if they are tired. That the collapse of a quiet pillar often comes without warning and without noise. And that perhaps the truest form of compassion isn't found in grand systems or flawless plans, but in simply being there, in noticing, in holding someone gently when they finally allow themselves to need a silent fall in a world still learning how to listen. Clarisse was taken to the local hospital in less than 20 minutes. The doctor said she was exhausted, severely dehydrated, and showed signs of chronic anemia that she had known about but chose to ignore due to the cost. When Nathaniel heard the words "never treated," he felt something tighten deep inside him, as though an invisible hand had reached in and clenched around his heart. How could a woman who had stood beside him for more than 3 decades quietly carry an illness that no one ever noticed? How could someone who once walked the hallways with his crying daughter in her arms, who made every meal on time, who washed every sheet in her own quiet way, be forgotten by an entire household as if she were just part of the furniture? When he spoke to the nurse, she asked who the patient's next of kin was. He was silent for a moment, then said he wasn't family. He was just someone she used to care for. The truth of that answer struck him like a blade. It was too accurate and far too painful. While waiting for the test results, he found a quiet corner in the hospital, pulled out his phone and searched the name Clarisse Johnson. Only a handful of scattered results appeared. One old article from over 30 years ago told the story of a nurse who had helped evacuate patients from a nursing home during a fire. There was a blurred black and white photo, a younger Clarisse in a white coat, holding the hand of an elderly man in distress. No medals, no public recognition. Just a small column buried in pages no one remembered. He scrolled further. A few internal hospital newsletters mentioned her as someone skilled, always willing to cover extra shifts, even when not asked. There was no farewell when she left the profession. No one recorded that she had once saved lives, but she had. She had saved lives. And then she became the housekeeper, the woman who mopped the floors, who brought meals exactly on time, who always stood behind a door no one thought to open. Nathaniel wondered how many people like her had lived so quietly that the world forgot who they used to be, where they had been when something important happened. He thought of all the people who had walked past Clarisse without ever asking if she was tired, if she needed something, if there was anything she wanted to say, himself included. He had sat across from her in the breakfast room every morning, watched her prepare tea, but never once asked if she had eaten. Now, she lay in a stark, white room, connected to IVs, so still that he could hear the soft, metallic hum of the machine beside her. And he sat next to her, holding her hand, realizing for the first time that some people had quietly kept his entire world from falling apart and left no sound behind. No one remembered. No one asked. No one looked long enough to see. But he remembered, and from this moment on, he would not forget. Clarisse was not just the woman who worked in his house. She was a part of the history he had overlooked. A piece of the soul that held everything together when he was not there to do it himself, and now it was time for him to be there, for her. After 3 days in the hospital, Clarisse was discharged with a long list of medications she needed to take on schedule, dietary supplements to restore her strength, and follow-up appointments she was not accustomed to keeping. It was Nathaniel who brought her home, but not to the grand estate where she had once worked. He took her to a small apartment he had just rented near Willow Haven. It wasn't large, but it was quiet, filled with soft morning light filtering through the curtains, a comfortable armchair, and a kitchen where she could cook only if she wanted to, not because she had to. He placed the keys on the table, handed her a small notebook filled with reminders, and told her, this time, she didn't have to do anything except rest. Clarisse looked at him, her eyes filled with both gratitude and hesitation. She was not used to being cared for, but she understood that it was time she was allowed to be vulnerable, just once. Meanwhile, Nathaniel returned to Willow Haven, not merely as a volunteer but with a new purpose. He walked into the meeting room with Leona and her team, carrying an entirely different plan. It was not a blueprint based on sensors or data, but a model rooted in lived experience, careful observation, and empathy. He did not begin with statistics or charts. He began with a story. Clarisse's story, about how someone who had once saved lives could quietly collapse in the very space built to nurture kindness. About how a well-intentioned system could overlook those who made no noise. Leona listened without interrupting. And when he finished, she asked only one question. What do you want to call this system? Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, then said, I'm not giving it a technical name. I just want to call it the network of quiet hands. The people who never stand on stage, but are always there in the back row. Leona smiled. She understood. Together, they rebuilt each process, not by discarding the old, but by gently reshaping it through real-world experience. They added one simple line to every evaluation form. Who was the quiet hand that helped you complete this? They redesigned the daily schedule not only around efficiency, but around natural rhythms and emotional recovery. Instead of time cards, they placed a small board at the entrance with just one question. Did you sleep well? Do you want to be checked on today? Or would you prefer quiet? Small things, seemingly trivial, but placed in the right moments, they began to shift the entire system. Nathaniel also introduced a new fund into the project. He named it the Gentle Hands Fund. There was no founder's name attached. It was simply there for people like Clarisse, for retired nurses, for single mothers, for those who had worked in the background of every institution to access healthcare, rest, and community support. There were no press conferences, no official announcements. Nathaniel simply stayed with Leona and her team, listening as they turned ideas into practice. For the first time in his life, he saw a system that did not need to be perfect to be right. Because what made it alive was not the code or the dashboards, but the hearts of the people who never appeared in performance reports, the ones who held others up when they were weary, the ones like Clarisse, the ones he had once overlooked. And now he was learning how to place them at the center, not with titles, but with action. A system rewritten not by programming languages, but by listening, not through technology, but through humanity. Under the warm amber lights of the small hall at Willow Haven, Leona stood before a quiet gathering, each person waiting patiently for her to speak. In the past, she had always been the one in the background. The one who checked whether the meals were still warm enough, who double-checked each child's medication list, who stitched torn pillows and gently reminded everyone of bedtime. But today, every gaze was turned toward her. Not because she raised her voice, not because anyone called her forward, but because she had quietly become the anchor for things once scattered and uncertain. When Clarisse was still in the hospital, it was Leona who kept the center's rhythm steady, not through commands, but through unwavering presence and empathy. She didn't try to replace Clarisse. She didn't mimic the older woman's way. She simply did it in her own manner, quiet, steady, and never turning away from even the smallest question. People began to notice. Younger volunteers started asking for her thoughts before introducing a new game. Parents called for advice on how to speak with their children. Even community organizations from neighboring districts came to Willow Haven, not just to meet with Nathaniel as before, but to hear Leona speak. During the first meeting of community representatives, when a guest asked who had been coordinating all these recent changes, Nathaniel didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned to Leona, smiled, and said, "She did." That simple sentence, more than any title, drew a silence across the room. No one had imagined that the young woman once mistaken for a temporary worker was now the one rebuilding, from the ground up, a sanctuary for hundreds. Leona hadn't changed her wardrobe. She still wore the same old button-down shirt, her hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck, and shoes that had long since faded. But the way she walked, the way she listened, the way she held eye contact when someone spoke, made people believe that if this entire center were placed in her hands, it would be cared for with grace and thoughtfulness. One afternoon, while clearing out the old book storage, Nathaniel asked if she had ever imagined leading a place like this. Leona shook her head. "I just wanted to make sure the kids wouldn't grow up feeling forgotten, the way my mother once did. I don't need to be in charge. I just want to be the one who doesn't leave." Her answer left him speechless, because he understood. True leaders aren't always the first to step onto the stage. They're the last ones standing when everyone else has given all they had. Leona had become that kind of person. Not grand in her promises, not loud in her presence. Just someone who once watched her mother hold herself together day after day without anyone asking if she was tired, and decided she would never let that happen to anyone else. And because of her, an entire system that once ran on procedures alone now had a pulse, a heart, a soul, a leader no one had expected, but one everyone now needed. The name came one early morning, before the sunlight had even touched the doorstep. Nathaniel sat alone in the newly renovated office at Willow Haven, a thick folder in front of him, filled with months of quiet trials and shared effort between him and Leona. Each line of text, each figure and note, carried within it the silent momentum of a group no one ever really saw, but whose presence kept the entire system going. He thought of Clarisse, of her thin yet tireless hands that had prepared countless meals, cooled fevered brows with damp cloths, mended torn clothes, and never once asked for recognition. He thought of Leona, who had taken the hand of every frightened child in the dark and never hesitated to stay until the trembling stopped. Hands like those never demanded to be seen. They never sought praise. They simply existed, quietly and steadily, doing what needed to be done when no one else could. Quiet hands. He wrote the phrase in the center of a blank page. Then he looked at it for a long time. It was not a name chosen to impress. It was a declaration. It did not need spotlight. It did not ask to lead. It only asked to be present when it mattered. A week later, in a small meeting with the core team, he announced the founding of the Quiet Hands Foundation. It would bear no corporate stamp, carry no grand affiliations, and would not be named after himself. The foundation was built to support the individuals and communities who quietly keep the world from unraveling. Retired nurses, caregivers who worked in the shadows, teachers in remote villages, women like Clarisse, people who never complained, who never asked for anything, but whose fall would shake the fragile balance of so many lives. Leona was the first to sign the charter. She didn't give a speech. She simply said, "This is for those who never walk away, even when no one calls their name." And from that moment, each small brick was laid, a flexible medical assistance program for informal caregivers, a community platform for sharing skills and offering urgent support, a scholarship system for the children of those who worked in silence. There was no need to be wealthy, no need to be famous. Only a simple truth, that once you held someone's hand when they needed it most. The Quiet Hands Foundation did not begin with noise. It began with purposeful stillness. And that is what gave it strength. Because the kindest things in the world have always begun with a hand extended into the quiet, asking for nothing in return. The first fundraiser for the Quiet Hands Foundation was not held in a grand hotel ballroom or a vast event hall. Instead, it took place in the backyard of Willow Haven, the same patch of earth where children had spent months running, painting, and dreaming. Strings of warm yellow lights were draped between the trees, chairs and tables neatly arranged, the tablecloths old but lovingly cleaned and pressed by the children themselves. There was no elevated stage, no flickering LED screens. Just an old microphone and a row of guest chairs occupied by neighbors, retired nurses, teachers, social workers, and a few sponsors who had come more out of curiosity than conviction. Leona was the first to speak. She didn't read a speech. She told a story about her mother. About the nights her mother stayed awake worrying over a fevered child, yet still rose before dawn to cook for others. About how her mother never refused to help, even as her hands began to tremble with age. She spoke of quiet collapse and how people like her mother could be forgotten simply because they never made a sound. Then she looked around, her voice low but certain, and said, "We don't need heroes who come and go. We need the ones who stay behind to clean up after the party, to keep the light on when others have stepped away. We don't need saviors, we need neighbors." Her words didn't bring the crowd to thunderous applause. Instead, they drew the entire yard into stillness, a stillness layered with something deeper than silence, as though someone had finally named a feeling so many had carried but never known how to speak aloud. Nathaniel, sitting in the very last row, bowed his head slightly. He understood those words better than anyone, because he had once come to save, with money, with plans, with authority. But he had come to learn that what the people here needed was not someone to change them, but someone willing to stay, to listen, and to become a part of something real. That night, no one talked about how much money had been raised. Instead, there were handshakes, embraces, exchanged glances, and quiet promises to return. Together, they formed a silent covenant that no one would be left behind, that anyone could be a gentle hand in someone else's life. No titles, no spotlight, just sincerity. And the willingness to be a true neighbor in a world slowly forgetting how to live close to one another. Throughout that evening's fundraiser, not a single person mentioned the name Nathaniel Reed. There was no MC introducing him as the founder, no words of thanks spoken into a microphone, no banner bearing the logo of the company he once built. And yet, he did not feel forgotten. In fact, it was exactly how he wanted to be present. Behind the curtain draped behind the small makeshift stage, he stood quietly with a warm cup of tea that Clarisse had prepared for him earlier that morning, his eyes following every word Leona spoke. Every subtle reaction from the audience, every slow nod from those who had come only to observe but now pressed their hands to their chests, overcome by emotion. He didn't need to be seen. He only needed to know that what was unfolding out there was real, that these stories were no longer just words on a page, that the ideas that once kept him awake through the night had taken root, had found stewards, had found a place to grow. Once, an old acquaintance happened to uncover his role in the Quiet Hands Foundation and asked why he didn't step forward to take the recognition he deserved. Nathaniel simply smiled and said, "Some things only grow large when we are small enough not to cast a shadow over them." He had once had it all: wealth, power, prestige, but he had never known the quiet peace he felt now, watching from the wings as others stepped into the light, not for glory, but with genuine belief. He still gave, still worked without title, still met quietly with those in need. But he let Leona lead, let Clarisse be the story told, let the children become the heart of it all. And when someone asked who was behind all the change, those at Willow Haven simply smiled and said, there was someone who once came to understand and chose to stay to listen. That was enough. Not everyone is born to be a symbol. Some people, when they choose to remain behind the curtain, end up illuminating the entire stage, not with applause, but with a presence that is silent yet irreplaceable, like Nathaniel, always there, even when no one calls his name. The west wall of Willow Haven had always been a blank, white stretch, untouched, as if no one dared hang anything there for fear of disrupting the clean symmetry of the community house. It stood cold and anonymous, as though every brick was laid to keep the outside world at bay. But then one day, Leona proposed transforming that wall into a space to trace the memory of all those who had passed through, not through names, but through color, images, fragments of feeling. They called it the Wall of Belonging. The children were the first to lift their brushes, a crooked house with chimney smoke curling into the sky, a hand holding a smaller hand, a dirt road marked with scattered footprints, a window thrown open with its curtain blowing in the wind. Each drawing was simple, unpolished, but carried unmistakable emotion. Then came the adults. Clarisse painted a handkerchief, just like the one she always used to wipe the brows of feverish children. A young girl who had only recently arrived drew the stone bench where she had sat alone, crying the day she left her mother. A single father painted the bag of food Leona had quietly left at his door the previous winter. Nathaniel did not paint anything. He simply stood, one hand resting lightly on the dried paint, as though trying to recall a part of his memory he had once forgotten. And then, one late afternoon, with the sun slanting through the trees behind the house, he handed Leona a small piece of paper. On it, a sketch of a house, not perfect, not symmetrical. But warm light shone from each window. A figure stood at the porch, the steps were overgrown with wildflowers, and 3 people were walking toward it. No names, no clear faces. But everyone who saw it felt they had known them forever. Leona nodded, smiled, and painted that sketch onto the lower corner of the wall, as if to say, belonging does not need to be declared. It only needs to be felt. That wall is no longer a void. It is a map of emotion, a silent journal, a place where lives that once passed through this space have left their trace. And every time someone visits Willow Haven for the first time, they often pause there for a long while, not because it is beautiful, but because it is true. Like this place itself, not perfect, but enough. Enough to make anyone feel they have a place, a once empty wall now filled with the one feeling every human needs to keep walking forward, the feeling that they were seen, that they were once part of something, that they belong. As the late afternoon light stretched long across the stone steps and laughter of children rang softly through the air, Clarisse sat beside, the wall awash in color, gently took Leona's hand and gazed at the painting of the house with its warm, glowing windows. Then, in a voice as light as the breeze, she whispered, "I think, now, we're all living there." The words drifted quietly into the air, yet settled deeply in the hearts of those who heard them. A quiet truth that needed no explanation. Because in a place that had once felt cold and hollow, there was now life, human connection, and gratitude. Willow Haven had become more than a care center. It had become a home. A place where stories are truly heard, where pain is gently met with comfort, and where quiet hands are finally held in return. Through this story, perhaps each of us is reminded that in a world filled with loud voices and glowing screens, there remains a profound power in stillness, in unacknowledged kindness, in the good that asks for nothing in return. It is this, after all, that makes life softer, more human. How did today's story speak to you? Did it make you think of someone who once helped you quietly, without asking for recognition? Or did it stir the question of whether you've ever overlooked someone who simply needed a kind glance? If you feel moved, we invite you to share your reflections in the comments below. Our team reads every message and would be honored to hear your thoughts, straight from the heart. And if this story felt meaningful to you, Don't forget to subscribe to the Emotional Echoes channel, like the video, and share it with someone who might need it. Your support helps us bring more of these stories into the world each day. Thank you for staying with us until the very last moment. Wishing you and your loved ones good health, joy, and the kind of peace that stays with you quietly. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you in the next story.